Welcome to my YouTube channel, a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, survival, and the human spirit. Before we set out on this emotional journey, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories that will leave you speechless. In the summer of 1847, the Georgia sun hung mercilessly over Magnolia Grove plantation, its rays filtering through the Spanish moss draped across ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. In a small cabin tucked away from the grand white mansion, Margaret Whitmore sat alone at the edge of her narrow bed, her pale hands trembling as she clutched a letter from her mother-in-law. "Margaret, dear, it has been 5 years since your marriage to my son. The family grows concerned about the future of our lineage. Perhaps it is time to consider alternative arrangements." The words burned in her mind like brands on cattle. At 26, Margaret had become the plantation's greatest failure, a barren wife in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs. Her husband, Thomas Whitmore, had grown distant, spending more time in the fields and less in their shared bed. The whispers among the house slaves had not escaped her notice. Margaret's cabin, originally built as guest quarters, had become her refuge from the judgmental eyes of the main house. Here, surrounded by simple wooden furniture and faded floral wallpaper, she could cry without shame, pray without pretense, and contemplate the impossible choices that lay before her. The afternoon heat made the small space stifling. Sweat beaded on Margaret's forehead as she paced the cramped room, her cotton dress clinging uncomfortably to her thin frame. She had lost weight over the past months, her appetite diminished by constant anxiety and the bitter herbs the plantation's midwife had prescribed, remedies that had proven as useless as her prayers. The cabin itself told the story of her decline. Once carefully maintained with fresh flowers and polished surfaces, it now bore the marks of neglect. Dust gathered on the windowsills, and the once bright curtains had faded to a dull yellow. Even her personal belongings seemed to mock her: the silver hairbrush that had been a wedding gift, the delicate china tea set that had belonged to her grandmother, the leather-bound Bible where she had once recorded the dates of her monthly courses with hopeful anticipation. Margaret walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall and studied her reflection with brutal honesty. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes, and her once lustrous brown hair had grown dull and lifeless. She looked older than her years, worn down by constant pressure and disappointment. Her mother-in-law's letter had been the final blow, a polite but unmistakable ultimatum wrapped in the language of family concern. The Whitmore family had built their fortune on cotton and careful breeding of both their crops and their bloodline. Thomas was the only surviving son, and the pressure to continue the family name had grown unbearable. Margaret had heard the whispered conversations between Thomas and his overseer, discussions about the fertility of certain slave women, and the common practice of masters taking concubines to ensure heirs when wives proved barren. A soft knock interrupted her tormented thoughts. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her appearance. "Come in," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open, and Celia stepped inside. At 19, Celia possessed a natural grace that seemed to defy her circumstances. Her dark skin gleamed with perspiration from the day's work, and her calloused hands spoke of years spent in the cotton fields and the main house kitchen. Despite the coarse fabric of her work dress and the worn head wrap that covered her hair, there was something regal about her bearing, a quiet dignity that had not gone unnoticed by the plantation inhabitants. Celia had been watching Margaret's decline with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. As one of the house servants, she had witnessed the private moments of despair, the tears hastily wiped away when footsteps approached, the way Margaret's hands shook when she thought no one was looking. But Celia had also observed something else, an intelligence and determination that most people overlooked in their assessment of the plantation mistress. "Mrs. Whitmore," Celia said, her voice steady but cautious, "Master Thomas sent me to check on you, said you hadn't taken your afternoon meal." Margaret studied the young woman before her. Celia had been born on the plantation, the daughter of Sarah, the head cook, and a field hand who had been sold away when Celia was just a child. Unlike many of the other enslaved women, Celia could read, a skill she had acquired secretly by observing the Whitmore children's lessons from the kitchen doorway. The loss of Celia's father had shaped her in ways that Margaret was only beginning to understand. At the age of 7, Celia had watched her father loaded onto a wagon with other slaves being sold to pay off a gambling debt. The trauma of that separation had taught her that survival required more than just obedience. It demanded intelligence, planning, and the ability to recognize and seize opportunities when they arose. "I'm not hungry," Margaret replied, turning away from Celia's penetrating gaze. There was something unsettling about the way this particular slave looked at her, not with the downcast eyes and submissive posture she expected, but with a directness that suggested intelligence and perhaps judgment. Celia remained standing by the door, making no move to leave. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, watching and waiting for the right opportunity to approach Margaret with an idea that could change both their lives. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she spoke again. "Mrs., if I may, you look troubled." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Troubled, that's one way to put it." She turned back to face Celia, and for a moment the careful barriers between mistress and slave seemed to waver. "Tell me, Celia, what do you know about failure?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Celia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. She thought of her father's face as the wagon pulled away, of her mother's silent tears in the months that followed, of the countless small humiliations and cruelties that defined daily life for enslaved people. "I know about surviving it, Mrs., surviving it," Margaret repeated, sinking back onto the bed. "Yes, I suppose that's what I'm trying to do." She looked up at Celia with sudden intensity. "Do you know why I'm here, in this cabin, instead of in the main house where a proper wife should be?" Celia hesitated. The truth was, everyone on the plantation knew the whispered conversations in the slave quarters, the knowing looks exchanged between the house servants, the way Master Thomas had begun paying attention to some of the younger slave women. It all painted a clear picture of a marriage in crisis. But there were also rumors about Margaret's visits to doctors in Savannah, about expensive treatments that had yielded no results, about the increasing desperation that had driven her to seek solitude in this remote cabin. "I know you're hurting, Mrs., Celia said carefully. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as 5 years of suppressed anguish poured out. "I can't give him a child, Celia. I've tried everything, prayers, medicines, treatments from doctors in Savannah. Nothing works, and now—" She held up the letter with shaking hands. "Now his family wants him to find another way." The raw pain in Margaret's voice struck Celia unexpectedly. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, both women understood the particular agony of powerlessness, the feeling of being trapped by forces beyond their control. Margaret's inability to conceive had made her as much a prisoner of her circumstances as Celia was of her legal status. Celia stepped closer, her natural compassion overriding the social boundaries that should have kept her at a distance. "Another way, a surrogate," Margaret whispered, the word tasting like poison on her tongue. "Someone young and fertile who can give him what I cannot." She looked directly at Celia, and in that moment both women understood the terrible implication hanging between them. The cabin fell silent except for the distant sounds of plantation life, the lowing of cattle, the voices of field hands returning from their work, the creak of the old oak tree outside the window. Celia felt her heart begin to race as she realized why she had truly been summoned to this cabin. But alongside the fear came something else, a recognition that this moment represented the opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. "Mrs.," she said slowly, "what exactly are you asking of me?" Margaret stood and walked to the small window, gazing out at the cotton fields where dozens of enslaved people labored under the brutal sun. The sight of their bent backs and sweat-stained clothes reminded her of the vast gulf that separated her world from theirs. even as she prepared to bridge that gulf in the most intimate way possible. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I'm asking you to save my marriage, Celia. I'm asking you to give my husband the child I cannot." The words hit Celia like a physical blow. She had known this moment might come, had seen it happen to other women on neighboring plantations, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. Her mind raced through the implications, the violation of her body, the child she would bear but never truly claim, the complex web of emotions and power dynamics such an arrangement would create. But even as horror and revulsion filled her, another part of Celia's mind began to calculate. In a world where she had no power, no choices, no control over her own destiny, this moment represented something unprecedented: leverage. Margaret needed something that only Celia could provide, and that need created a space for negotiation that had never existed before. "And what would I receive in return?" Celia asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Margaret turned from the window, surprised by the question. She had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even refusal, though they both knew refusal was not truly an option for an enslaved woman. She had not expected negotiation. The boldness of Celia's response forced Margaret to confront the reality that she was dealing with an equal, not a piece of property. I hadn't thought," Margaret stammered. "Then perhaps you should," Celia said, taking a step closer. "Because what you're asking of me is not just my body, Mrs. You're asking for my soul, my future, my very self, and in my experience, nothing of value comes without a price." The two women stared at each other across the small cabin, and in that moment the traditional power structure of the plantation seemed to shift. Margaret, for all her legal and social authority, was the one in desperate need. Celia, despite her bondage, held something Margaret desperately wanted. It was a reversal of the natural order that both women found simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Celia's response would change both their lives forever. The afternoon shadows grew longer as Celia considered her response. Outside, she could hear the plantation bell ringing, signaling the end of the workday for the field hands. Soon, the slave quarters would come alive with the sounds of evening meals being prepared, and children playing in the dusty yards between the cabins. But here in this small room that smelled of lavender water and desperation, time seemed suspended. The weight of the moment pressed down on both women like the oppressive Georgia heat. Celia had spent her entire life preparing for an opportunity like this, though she had never imagined it would come in such a form. Every book she had secretly read, every conversation she had overheard, every observation she had made about the workings of power and privilege had led to this moment. "Freedom," Celia said finally, the word hanging in the air like a prayer, "not just for me, but for my mother as well." Margaret's face went pale. The request was both expected and shocking in its directness. In the antebellum South, the manumission of slaves was a complex legal process fraught with restrictions and social taboos. Free blacks faced constant harassment and the ever-present threat of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. Yet Celia was asking for the one thing that Margaret had the power to grant, but had never seriously considered giving. "Celia, you know I can't or won't." Celia interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "You're asking me to bear a child that will be raised as your own, to submit to your husband's desires whenever he calls, to carry the burden of your family's future in my womb. And you think I should do this for nothing more than the privilege of remaining enslaved?" The logic was unassailable, and Margaret found herself struggling to formulate a counter-argument. She had been raised to view slavery as a natural and beneficial institution, a system that provided care and guidance for an inferior race while generating prosperity for their betters. But Celia's words forced her to confront the fundamental injustice of expecting someone to sacrifice everything while receiving nothing in return. Margaret sank into the room's single wooden chair, overwhelmed by the boldness of Celia's demands. In her sheltered world, She had never truly considered the perspective of the enslaved people who surrounded her daily life. They were fixtures like the furniture or the landscape necessary for the plantation's function, but not quite real in their humanity. Now, faced with Celia's intelligence and determination, that comfortable illusion was crumbling. "The plantation needs workers," Margaret said weakly. "Thomas would never agree to free valuable slaves." "Then perhaps Thomas doesn't need an heir as badly as you think," Celia replied, moving to stand directly in front of Margaret. "Because I assure you, Mrs., there are other women on this plantation who could serve your purpose, but none of them can read, write, or understand the delicate nature of what you're proposing." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Celia was making it clear that she was not just another enslaved woman to be used and discarded. Her education and intelligence made her uniquely qualified for the role Margaret needed her to play. But those same qualities also made her dangerous if her cooperation could not be secured. Margaret looked up sharply. "You can read, I can read, write, and cipher numbers," Celia confirmed, skills that might prove useful in managing the discretion this arrangement would require. The implications of Celia's literacy sent a chill through Margaret. An educated slave was dangerous, capable of forging papers, communicating with abolitionists, or simply understanding far more about the world beyond the plantation than was safe for the existing order. The fact that Celia had managed to acquire these skills without detection spoke to a level of cunning and determination that Margaret had never suspected. Celia had learned to read by positioning herself near the schoolroom where the Whitmore children received their lessons. Hidden behind the kitchen door, she had memorized the shapes of letters and the sounds they made. Later, she had practiced writing with charcoal on pieces of bark, carefully destroying the evidence of her forbidden education. The risk had been enormous. Literacy among slaves was illegal in Georgia, punishable by severe whipping or worse. "How long have you been able to read?" Margaret asked. "Since I was 12, Celia answered honestly. "I learned by watching your children's lessons and practicing with scraps of paper I found in the main house. My mother doesn't know. She would have beaten me for taking such a risk." Margaret felt a strange mixture of admiration and fear. This young woman had been living a double life for years, acquiring knowledge that could be her death sentence if discovered by the wrong people. The courage and intelligence required for such deception spoke to a strength of character Margaret had never suspected. It also explained why Celia carried herself differently from the other slaves. She possessed an inner confidence that came from knowledge and the secret awareness of her own capabilities. "If I were to consider your proposal," Margaret said carefully, "how would we arrange such a thing? The legal complications alone." Celia had been preparing for this question for years. During her secret reading sessions, she had studied not just literature and history, but also legal documents and newspapers that discussed the complex laws governing slavery and manumission. She understood the bureaucratic requirements, the financial obligations, and the social obstacles that would need to be overcome. "Leave the legal complications to me," Celia said. "I've been thinking about freedom for a long time, Mrs. I know about manumission papers, about the requirements for legal emancipation. What I need from you is a commitment, a written agreement that when I fulfill my part of this bargain, you will fulfill yours." Margaret's mind reeled. The conversation had taken a turn she never could have anticipated. What had begun as a desperate plea for help had become a complex negotiation with a woman she was beginning to realize she had drastically underestimated. The power dynamic between them was shifting with each exchange, and Margaret found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the supplicant. "And if the child is not born healthy," Margaret asked, "if something goes wrong, then you will have lost nothing more than you've already lost," Celia replied. "But I will have risked everything, which is why I need guarantees beyond just the promise of eventual freedom." "What kind of guarantees?" Celia had clearly thought this through with the thoroughness of a lawyer preparing a case. "Better quarters for my mother and me during the pregnancy, access to proper medical care, not just the plantation midwife, but a real doctor from town, and protection from the overseer's whip. No matter what infractions he might claim, Margaret nodded slowly. These requests seemed reasonable, even necessary for ensuring a healthy pregnancy. The plantation's overseer, a brutal man named Jake Morrison, was known for his harsh treatment of the slaves under his supervision. Protecting Celia from his violence would require careful maneuvering, but it was certainly within Margaret's power to arrange. But Celia wasn't finished. I also want to choose when and how this happens, she continued. I won't be summoned to your husband's bed like some breeding animal. If we do this, it will be on terms that preserve what dignity I can maintain. The boldness of this demand took Margaret's breath away. In the world she knew, enslaved women had no say in such matters. Masters took what they wanted when they wanted it, with no consideration for the feelings or preferences of their human property. But Celia was proposing something different, a transaction between equals, despite the vast legal and social inequalities that separated them. The request also revealed something important about Celia's character. Despite her desperate circumstances, she was determined to maintain some measure of self-respect and agency. This was not a woman who would submit passively to whatever was demanded of her. She would be an active participant in her own fate, negotiating the terms of her cooperation rather than simply accepting whatever was offered. Thomas would never agree to such conditions, Margaret said. Then Thomas doesn't need to know about the conditions, Celia replied. He only needs to know that you found a solution to your problem. How that solution is implemented can remain between us. The suggestion that they would deceive Thomas added another layer of complexity to their arrangement. Margaret would need to become an active conspirator in the seduction of her own husband, orchestrating encounters between him and Celia while maintaining the pretense that any relationship that developed was natural and spontaneous. Margaret stood and began pacing again, her mind racing through the possibilities and pitfalls of such an arrangement. The risk was enormous. If discovered, both women could face severe consequences. Margaret could be ostracized from society, divorced by her husband, and left destitute. Celia could be sold to the brutal plantations of the Deep South or worse, but the potential reward was equally significant, an heir for the Whitmore family and freedom for Celia and her mother. There's something else, Celia said, her voice softer now. The child. What happens to my relationship with the child? This was the question Margaret had been dreading. In the traditional arrangement Celia was proposing, the child would legally belong to the Whitmores, raised as their own with no acknowledgement of its true parentage. But Celia's question suggested she wanted something more, a connection to the child she would bear but could never publicly claim. The maternal instinct in Celia's voice was unmistakable, and it forced Margaret to confront an aspect of their arrangement she had tried to avoid considering. This would not be a simple business transaction. A child would be born from this agreement, a human being with its own needs, desires, and rights. That child would have two mothers, one legal, one biological, and the relationship between all three of them would be fraught with complexity. The child would be raised as mine and Thomas's, Margaret said carefully. That's the only way this could work. I understand that, Celia replied. But I want to remain on the plantation until the child is old enough to understand its true parentage. I want to be part of its life, even if I can never claim it publicly. Margaret felt a stab of jealousy at the thought of sharing her long-awaited child with its biological mother. But she also recognized the humanity in Celia's request, the natural desire of a mother to know and love her child. The arrangement would require both women to navigate an emotional minefield, balancing their competing claims to the same child while maintaining the fiction that Margaret was its only mother. How long, Margaret asked, until the child is 10 years old? Celia said. Old enough to understand the truth, but young enough to accept it without resentment. And then my mother and I take our freedom and leave Georgia forever. Finality of Celia's words struck Margaret with unexpected force. She had been so focused on the immediate problem of conceiving an heir that she had not fully considered the long-term implications of their arrangement. In 10 years, she would lose not only Celia, but also the child's connection to its biological heritage. The child would grow up knowing the truth about its parentage, but would have to live with that knowledge in secret, never able to acknowledge its true mother publicly. Margaret walked to the window again, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the cotton fields. In the distance, she could see Thomas riding back from his inspection of the day's harvest, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Soon he would expect her to join him for dinner, to play the role of the beautiful wife while they both pretended not to notice the growing distance between them. The sight of her husband reminded Margaret of everything she stood to lose if she could not provide him with an heir. The Whitmore family had made it clear that their patience was exhausted. If she could not conceive soon, Thomas would be pressured to take more drastic measures, perhaps even to set her aside in favor of a more fertile wife. The thought of losing her position, her home, and her identity as Mrs. Thomas Whitmore was more terrifying than any risk involved in Celia's proposal. "I need time to think," Margaret said finally. "Of course," Celia replied, "but don't take too long, Mrs. Time is something neither of us can afford to waste." As Celia moved toward the door, Margaret called out to her, "Celia, why are you willing to do this? Surely there must be other ways to gain your freedom." Celia paused with her hand on the door handle. The question forced her to confront the brutal realities of her situation. Other paths to freedom, escape, purchase, or gradual manumission, were either impossible or would take decades to achieve. This opportunity, terrible as it was, represented her best, and perhaps only chance to secure not just her own liberation, but her mother's as well. Because, Mrs., sometimes the only way to win a game is to change the rules, and right now you need me more than I need you. That's not a position I'm likely to find myself in again." With that, Celia stepped out into the gathering dusk, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of an impossible decision. 3 days passed before Margaret summoned Celia back to the cabin. 3 days during which Margaret barely slept, picked at her meals, and avoided her husband's increasingly concerned questions about her health. She had spent hours walking the plantation grounds, weighing the moral complexities of what she was considering against the stark reality of her situation. During those 3 days, Margaret had also conducted her own investigation into the feasibility of Celia's demands. She had discreetly consulted legal documents in Thomas's study, researching the requirements for manumission in Georgia. The process was complex but not impossible. It required a formal petition to the state legislature, proof of the slave's good character, and a substantial bond to ensure that the freed person would not become a public burden. Margaret had also observed Celia more carefully during those 3 days, watching how she interacted with the other slaves, how she carried herself, how she managed her responsibilities in the main house. What she saw confirmed her growing impression that Celia was exceptional not just in intelligence, but in her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of plantation life while maintaining her dignity and purpose. On the 3rd evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the first drops of a summer storm began to fall, Margaret sent word through Sarah, the head cook, that Celia should come to the cabin. After the evening meal was served, the approaching storm seemed appropriate for the momentous decision Margaret was about to announce. When Celia arrived, she found Margaret sitting at the small wooden table with papers spread before her and a quill pen in her hand. The sight of the writing materials confirmed what Celia had hoped. Margaret had made her decision. But the formal arrangement of the documents also suggested that Margaret had spent considerable time thinking through the details of their arrangement. "Sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We need to discuss the details." Celia took her seat, noting the formal tone in Margaret's voice. The desperate, emotional woman from 3 days ago had been replaced by someone more composed, more businesslike. It was a transformation that spoke to hidden reserves of strength and suggested that Margaret was taking their arrangement seriously as a binding agreement rather than a desperate gamble. The change in Margaret's demeanor also reflected the internal struggle she had undergone during the past 3 days. She had wrestled with the moral implications of what she was proposing, the risks involved, and the long-term consequences for all parties involved. But she had also come to understand that this arrangement represented her only viable option for securing her future and fulfilling her role as Thomas's wife. "I've drafted an agreement," Margaret continued, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "I want you to read it and tell me if it captures your understanding of our arrangement." Celia picked up the document, her eyes scanning the carefully written lines. The language was formal, almost legal in its precision, suggesting that Margaret had consulted actual legal documents in preparing the agreement. Agreement between Margaret Whitmore and Celia, house servant of Magnolia Grove Plantation, dated this 15th day of August 1847, in consideration of services to be rendered by Celia in matter of providing an heir to the Whitmore family. The following terms are agreed upon. The document outlined everything they had discussed: the promise of freedom for both Celia and her mother upon the successful birth and raising of a healthy child, the improved living conditions during pregnancy, access to medical care, and protection from punishment. But there were additional clauses that surprised Celia, suggesting that Margaret had thought more deeply about their arrangement than Celia had expected. Education provisions, Celia read aloud, looking up at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding your literacy," Margaret explained. "If you're to remain on the plantation for 10 years after the child's birth, it would be beneficial for you to serve as a governess of sorts. Your education would need to be formalized and expanded." The suggestion revealed Margaret's practical intelligence. By positioning Celia as an educated servant with legitimate reasons to interact with the child, Margaret was creating a cover story that would explain Celia's continued presence on the plantation and her relationship with the child. It would also provide Celia with valuable skills that would serve her well in freedom. Celia continued reading, finding clauses about a monthly allowance of money to be held in trust, provisions for her mother's medical care as she aged, and even specifications about the type of housing they would be provided after gaining their freedom. The thoroughness of the document impressed her. Margaret had clearly spent considerable time thinking through not just the immediate arrangement but its long-term implications. "This is more generous than I expected," Celia admitted. "It's also more binding," Margaret replied. "Notice the penalty clauses." Celia found the section Margaret referenced, her expression growing serious as she read. The agreement specified that any attempt by Celia to reveal the true nature of their arrangement to Thomas or anyone else would result in immediate sale to a plantation in the Deep South, a fate that was essentially a death sentence. Similarly, any failure by Margaret to honor her commitments would result in Celia's right to expose the entire arrangement, which would destroy Margaret's marriage and social standing. "Mutual assured destruction," Celia murmured. "Exactly. We're both taking enormous risks. This ensures that neither of us can betray the other without facing severe consequences." The penalty clauses reflected the harsh realities of their situation. Both women were venturing into dangerous territory where discovery could mean ruin or death. The agreement created a balance of terror that would keep both parties honest, but it also highlighted the precarious nature of their alliance. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began pelting the cabin's roof with increasing intensity. The storm seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions swirling between the two women as they contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. The sound of the rain also provided cover for their conversation, ensuring that their words would not be overheard by anyone who might be passing by the cabin. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The physical arrangements. How do you want to handle that aspect?" Celia had dreaded this part of the conversation, but she had also prepared for it. The physical relationship with Thomas would be the most difficult and degrading aspect of their arrangement, but it was also the most crucial. Without Thomas's cooperation and participation, the entire plan would fail. I've given it considerable thought, Mrs. I believe the most dignified approach would be for you to arrange for your husband to encounter me in circumstances that would seem natural but private. Perhaps while I'm working alone in the main house during your absences." Margaret nodded, understanding the delicate psychology Celia was proposing. Rather than being summoned like a breeding animal, Celia would be positioned where Thomas might notice her and make his own advances, allowing her to maintain some semblance of choice in the matter. It would also make the relationship appear more natural and spontaneous, reducing the risk of suspicion. The approach also reflected Celia's understanding of male psychology. Thomas, like most men of his class and era, would be more comfortable pursuing what appeared to be a willing partner, rather than simply taking what he wanted by force. By creating the illusion of mutual attraction, Celia could make the experience more tolerable for herself while ensuring Thomas's continued participation. "And if he doesn't respond as expected," Margaret asked, "then we'll need to be more direct." Celia replied, "But I believe your husband is a man with normal appetites who has been denied satisfaction in his marriage bed. Given the opportunity and the right circumstances, nature will take its course." The clinical way Celia discussed the intimate details of the arrangement struck Margaret as both disturbing and oddly comforting. It suggested that Celia had found a way to emotionally distance herself from what would essentially be a form of sanctioned rape, even if both women were careful not to use that word. The ability to compartmentalize the physical and emotional aspects of the arrangement would be crucial for Celia's psychological survival. "When do we begin?" Margaret asked. "The timing needs to be carefully planned," Celia replied. "I've been tracking my monthly cycles. If we begin next week, and if conception occurs quickly, the child would be born in late spring. Good time for both mother and baby." Margaret marveled at the thoroughness of Celia's planning. This young woman had clearly been thinking about every aspect of their arrangement with a level of detail that spoke to both intelligence and determination. The fact that Celia had been tracking her own fertility cycles suggested that she had been preparing for this possibility long before their first conversation. "There's something else we need to discuss," Celia said, her tone becoming more serious. "What happens if I bear a daughter instead of a son?" Margaret had considered this possibility, and it troubled her deeply. In the patriarchal society of the antebellum South, male heirs were infinitely more valuable than female children. A daughter would not carry on the Whitmore name or inherit the plantation in the traditional manner. The pressure from Thomas's family was specifically for a male heir who could continue the family line. A healthy child of either gender would be acceptable, Margaret said finally, though she admitted to herself that a son would be preferable. And if the child shows obvious signs of its mixed heritage, this was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their entire plan. While Celia's skin was light enough that a child might pass for white, especially in infancy, there was always the risk that African features would become more pronounced as the child grew. A child who obviously appeared to be of mixed race would raise questions that could expose their entire arrangement. "We'll address that situation if it arises," Margaret said. "There are ways to explain such things: distant relatives with darker complexions, childhood illnesses that affect coloring. The important thing is that the child be healthy and intelligent." Celia nodded, though both women knew they were venturing into territory fraught with peril. A child who couldn't pass for white would face a lifetime of questions and potential exposure of their secret. The racial dynamics of the antebellum South made this one of the most unpredictable and dangerous aspects of their plan. "I have one final condition," Celia said, pulling a small piece of paper from her dress pocket. "I want to add this clause to our agreement." Margaret took the paper and read Celia's carefully written addition. "In the event that the child born of this arrangement shows characteristics that would make its parentage obvious, Celia and her mother will be granted immediate freedom and safe passage to a free state with sufficient funds to establish a new life. You're asking me to help you escape if the plan fails," Margaret said. I'm asking you to honor the spirit of our agreement, even if the letter of it becomes impossible. Celia replied, If this child cannot pass for your biological offspring, then our entire arrangement becomes a danger to all of us. In that case, the most logical solution is for my mother and me to disappear. Entirely, Margaret considered this addition carefully. It was reasonable, even necessary, but it also represented another layer of risk and complexity. Helping enslaved people escape to free states was a federal crime that could result in heavy fines and imprisonment. But if their plan failed in the way Celia described, helping her escape might be the only way to prevent exposure of the entire arrangement. Agreed, Margaret said finally, taking up her pen to add Celia's clause to the document. As Margaret wrote, Celia watched the rain streaming down the cabin's small window. Somewhere in the slave quarters, her mother was probably wondering where she was, perhaps worrying that she had gotten into trouble with the master or mistress. Sarah had no idea that her daughter was negotiating the terms of her own freedom, and Sarah's as well. The weight of responsibility for her mother's future added another dimension to Celia's decision. Sarah was approaching 50, an age when enslaved people often faced being sold to less desirable situations or simply worked to death. The promise of freedom would give Sarah a chance to live her final years in dignity, but it also meant that Celia was gambling with her mother's life as well as her own. It's done, Margaret said, setting down her pen. She signed her name with a flourish, then slid the document across to Celia. Your signature makes this binding. Celia took the pen, her hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. As she wrote her name, not the simple X that most enslaved people would have made, but her full name in careful script, she felt as though she was signing more than just an agreement. She was signing a declaration of her own agency, her refusal to be merely a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The act of signing her own name was itself a form of rebellion. Literacy among slaves was illegal, and the ability to sign legal documents was a privilege reserved for free people. By putting her signature on the agreement, Celia was asserting her humanity and her right to participate as an equal in determining her own fate. When do we tell your husband? Celia asked. We don't, Margaret replied. Thomas will know only what he needs to know, that I found a solution to our problem. The details of how that solution works will remain between us. Lightning illuminated the cabin as both women contemplated the path they had chosen. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was responding to the magnitude of their decision. The thunder and lightning seemed to underscore the dramatic nature of the moment, two women from vastly different worlds joining together in a conspiracy that would challenge the very foundations of the society that had created their desperate circumstances. Are you certain about this, Mrs.? Celia asked one final time. Margaret looked at the young woman across from her. This remarkable person who had somehow found a way to transform her own oppression into opportunity. The question forced Margaret to confront the full reality of what they were undertaking. There would be no turning back once they set their plan in motion. Both of their lives would be forever changed by the choices they were making in this small cabin on a stormy night. I'm certain that we're both taking the only chance we may ever have to control our own destinies, whether that